Hello, everyone. This is Father Tim. What I'd like to do during these times we're kind of isolated from one another is kind of go through some material that I've had in things that presentation I've given and kind of present them to you where you can view at your leisure. I hope to make a regular practice of this. Today, what I want to talk about is the Eucharist. And in this presentation, I've entitled Eucharist is Sacrifice, Giving Thanks, and Giving Life. Eucharist, in its original meaning, is thanksgiving. It comes from the Greek, and it's about giving life. Much of this obviously is from the pre-COVID times and is representative of times when we could gather together, but I'd like to suggest that it may give us something to think about during these times when we are in isolation and when many have chosen not to come together for Eucharist for very good reasons. When I was teaching, I did a survey every year in a large lecture class of my seniors, asking them why they don't go to church. Uh, the leading reason, as you see here, is they said they were too busy, with over about 55% of them saying that. Some of the other major reasons were it's boring, I don't get anything out of it, it's not spiritually fulfilling, or some were saying I'm not a Christian. And I think the one that don't get anything out of it, believe it or not, I think that's precisely kind of they put their finger on one of the main reasons why the problem with Mass. Looking at the other side, why Americans do go to church. This is from a survey from the Pew Foundation in August of 2018. And the number one reason, as you see with 81%, is so that we become closer to God. Others looking at so their children have a moral foundation, make me a better person, to give comfort in times of trouble, finding the sermons valuable, and then about over half looking at become a part of the community of faith. Some of the others bring continuing family religious traditions and feel an obligation to do so, to meet new people, to socialize, and to please family, spouse, or partner. So those are the reasons why they have gone to. One of my contentions is that there's no communion without sacrifice. And I mean this both in the religious sense and in the sense of looking at and being communion with others. Sacrifice is an investment. As you know, that in any relationship, we have to be committed to that. It's an investment that we have to give of ourselves, whether it's time or of ourselves, to make that relationship work. Forming relationships or community, and part of the reason I think we're seeing a little drop off in church attendance, again, pre-COVID, is that we tend to live in a very individualized culture. And we've kind of lost sight of some of those uh, looking at the common good. And so that also, I think, has some impact on kind of what's come to more of an individualized notion of spirituality, which people don't see the need for necessarily going. If we look at the elements that we use in Eucharist, the bread and wine, I want to look at those a little bit as symbols, as all our sacraments use symbols. And in the bread and wine that's used, we connect with all of creation. By the very nature of these elements of bread and wine, we're connected. The wheat and the grapes that come to make the bread and the wine, it comes from the seed, the soil, sun, and grain, the wine from the vine, the earth, and rain. So in the Eucharist, we are seeing all these things in some way that we're connected with all of creation. We look at the bread as a symbol. Bread is, as we know, formed by grains of wheat, many, many grains of wheat being crushed and into flour, which are then transformed into bread. We see the old millstone here, and some of the women in this upper corner here forming the bread or forming the wheat, crushing that into the stone, and the heavy gross. The grains are crushed. Similar way, grapes, when they turn into wine, we see the many grapes there. It takes a lot of grapes to make the grape juice, which then is fermented into wine. And here we see some of the old school kind of the grape crushing, which then forms the grape juice, which will then become wine. So both the grains of wheat and the grapes are crushed in order to become the bread and the. Many of you may remember a commercial from years ago about Wonder Bread. And the claim that Wonder Bread used to make is that it helps build bodies 12 different ways. And the other one you see is Wonder Bread helps build strong bodies for generations. And the claim was that Wonder Bread helped to build these bodies in many different ways. If we look at Eucharist then as bread, as our Wonder Bread, how much more can that help us grow in many different ways, both physically and spiritually? As I mentioned at the outset, I don't think that there can be communion without sacrifice. There was a movie a number of years ago called Babette's Feast, and in this feast, Babette was a world-renowned cook, and she was in France, and during the revolutionary times, she fled the country to kind of keep her freedom, and she ended up in this Danish small village where there are a couple of widows there, very abstemious village. And she would cook for these two older women, and one of the highlights of their meals, they would used to cook or put in old stale bread with ale and water. And that was kind of their meals. One day, Babette won the lottery, and so what she did is she spent all her winnings on cooking a big feast for this group of people in this small Danish town. And they brought in all kinds of food, and the people there thought this was just a waste. And they were saying before they were invited to this, they weren't going to enjoy it, they weren't going to talk. And through the sharing of food, they began to smile, and at the end of the movie, they're dancing away. It had an effect on them. So Babette spent all that she had in making this feast and bringing these people together to give them an experience of community. In Eucharist, we have also that it is the new covenant in Jesus' body and blood. And I'd like to look just a little bit at the idea of covenant and of contract that we have in our society today. Eucharist is obviously sacrifice. In more traditional ways, we talked about the holy sacrifice of the Mass. We'll look a little bit at the notion of sacrifice in the Scriptures and then see how this connects to our understanding of Eucharist. Covenant and a contract. Covenant, as we know, can also is used in civil legal proceedings. Legally, the effects of the covenant are ongoing. It's usually attached to property. Years ago, when I was at the college, we had a piece of land across from the campus that belonged to us, and we were selling part of those. And we had covenants on this land, one to the effect that buildings or the land closest to the college had to have nicer buildings than ones that were farther away. And no matter who owned this, even if someone bought it, built something, and then they sold that property, the covenant still remained in effect. It was ongoing. In contracts, it's a little bit different. The effects of the contract are reciprocal with the parties, and contracts can be renegotiated. And so I think, covenant is ongoing, contract is reciprocal, and it can be renegotiated by both parties. Throughout the Old Testament and into the New Testament, we have, and this is also in other religions as well. There were lots of animal sacrifices. It was a way to kind of connect them to the divinity. What happened was that an animal or grain was destroyed to symbolize the sacrificer's offering of self to God or the gods. One of the major sacrifices that was offered, the Paschal sacrifice, we remember at the time before the Hebrews escaped from Egypt and on their journey to the Promised Land, they were told to slaughter a lamb and then to sprinkle or to put that blood on the doorpost. Oftentimes in other sacrifices, that the blood of the animal was sprinkled on the people. And the blood for the Hebrews symbolized the life of the one that was sacrificed. So the blood poured out was a symbol of the life poured out for those people, and it had effects. In the Paschal sacrifice, we have the Lamb of God. We see in this picture here. And the blood of the Passover lamb became the source of life and of liberation for the Hebrews. It was only when the lintels of their doorposts were marked with the blood of the lamb that the angel of death passed over them and they were given new life. An interesting sculpture in Chartres Cathedral in France. I always found this one kind of interesting. Here we have the Nativity. It's in the sculpture there. And we see the crib there is kind of a representation similar to the altar there in the cathedral. And it was kind of the artist's conception saying, that even at the beginning when Jesus was laid in the manger, that feeding trough, he gave himself for food. And we see one of the animals there at the feeding trough. So it's to remind them that in Eucharist we have Jesus giving himself as food for our. Jesus in the Last Supper established the new covenant in his own blood. God's union with people is fully realized. We don't need animal sacrifices anymore to enable us to connect with God. We have done so with the blood of Jesus who gave his life so that we may have new life in God. It's no longer the blood of animals, but the blood of Christ. At the Lord's Supper, then, Jesus offers his blood as drink to seal that covenant. And we look at the idea of covenant, then the effects are ongoing. And so when we participate in Eucharist, although we don't drink from the cup during these days, we have the effects of that Last Supper that are ongoing. In John's Gospel, however, there's a unique twist to this. And unlike the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John has no what we call institution narrative of the Last Supper. For example, there's no take and eat, this is my body, take and drink, this is my blood. But what we do have in John's Gospel is the foot washing. As we know, this is the servant's job. For John, then, the Lord's Supper is about service to one another. We see in this picture here Jesus offering the bread and the cup to his apostles gathered around that table. For John, then, really what he sees Eucharist as is foot washing, as we see in this picture here. For John, the idea of service, of taking on the role of the servant, is really what the Last Supper was all about. And granted, this is a later kind of thinking on the part of Christians, as John's was the last gospel that was written, and so they've had time to reflect on really kind of deeper meanings of what the Lord's Supper was. So, in essence, then, when we gather for Eucharist, as like Jesus, so we imitate that, we see that Jesus offered himself as food, as nourishment to others. And in contemporary times, in practical times, we see, mothers that during pregnancy, the mother supplies all the nutrients for the developing baby, and then after the baby is born, the mother provides nourishment and food for others. So in real life, we see there are examples when, for example, mothers provide food for others. They supply all that they need. We find that in other ways. Often we can look at some of the saints, and one of them that came to my mind was Saint Damien of Molokai. He ministered to the lepers in Molokai. No one else wanted to, and then he contracts leprosy, and he obviously then died of that disease. Damien was made a saint on October 11th of 2009. So again, Damien was one who offered himself and service to others. He literally gave his life to those to whom he ministered. In the same way, we look at Mother Teresa. Most of us know St. Teresa of Calcutta. She also gave her life for poor children, especially those in her later years that were affected by AIDS, who were rejected by all. And she, although she didn't contract AIDS, she did give her life. She died in a sense like with her boots on, except she just wore, would not wear shoes. She was just in her bare feet. Another example of giving all, of being Eucharist to those she ministered. But we think about our own lives. We don't have the opportunity to literally give our lives to other people in most cases. But I'd like to suggest that even in small ways, we can be life-giving to others. For example, we spend time with a friend in need, or stop over to visit a neighbor who has a need. Helping family members, certainly when we could be doing something else, but that's a way that we can give life. And I think, the more that we try to remember these things, the better, the more it's going to help us to try to connect with our idea of Eucharist and helping us to be Eucharist to one another. We are following the command to become more like Him, more like Jesus. In Eucharist, the bread and wine physically become a part of us. And traditionally, we think of then that when we receive Eucharist, that we become more like Christ. And that's Jesus invited people to do that. And in fact, in John's Gospel, he says, whenever you do this, offer, remember me, offering themselves in service to one another. That became kind of his mandate to people to do this in memory of him. We become more like Christ then when we take on the role of the servant and when we sacrifice. As John says, as I have done, so must you do. That we must take on the role of servant in his life, not only in receiving him in Eucharist, but in doing what he did and offering ourselves in service to one another. As I mentioned, we saw in one of the opening slides, one of the reasons that people don't attend church or don't participate in Eucharist, and I hear this all the time, I don't get anything out of it. Well, I think that's precisely the people have kind of hit the nail on the head on why it doesn't make sense then. That what we do is that sometimes participation in Eucharist is passive. It's something that happens to us. We receive the Eucharist, and it often then separates Christ's actions from our own. We become, in a sense, like spectators in observing what's going on and don't take anything out of the doors of church into the world today. It's easy to focus on the bread and wine. If we see Jesus then is the one who has or is giving, that we can become isolated and passive. It's something that we kind of stand in the background watching what's happening at Mass, at Eucharist. We then become isolated and passive. And we see here, it's so easy then to kind of sit back in the pews and let this happen to us without taking anything outside of us, outside of the doors that if we look at what the idea of sacrifice, I think sacrifice can really unite us. When we make sacrifices for a person, we do that because of a concern or love, care for that person. We're giving up something of ourselves to kind of be more connected with that person. And suffering and pain can be, we look at that and we can consciously align that to the sacrifice of Jesus. That can be transforming. It can give value or meaning to our suffering. A lot of times when I would see people, our students who go out to, do service projects, and perhaps you can reflect on this on your own lives when you've done some form of ministry, that often people receive more than they give in service. They say, go out with the idea that they're going to be, giving something to these people who have very little. But almost to a one, when students come back, they would say, I got more out of this than I think that I gave. And that's often the case. One of the most striking things that I found in one of my students' papers, at the college, our baseball team and others used to have this Christmas party for the needy children of the area. And it got so, unfortunately, it was growing, which meant that there were more people living in rough conditions. And they would do this Christmas party where they would collect clothing, they would have games for the kids, they'd give up some of their meals so that the food service would donate to have a breakfast for these kids. And at the end, toward the last ones, we would have like 300 kids there. So it was a large thing. And one of my students, I would give them an opportunity if they wanted to do this service and then write a reflection on it. And one of my students did this, and I was really touched by what he said. And these are his words that were in a paper. He said that I attended Mass 2 times this semester. One time was after the Gallagher Christmas party that I was just talking about. And he said this time was because I wanted to. Mass was not very important at this point in my life, but this Sunday it was. I thought I'd benefit from the Word of God and communion. After I knelt in the pew and prayed after communion, I was able to see the works of Jesus Christ through all the volunteers that were present. Giving back to the community allowed me a great sense of satisfaction in Mass and communion, which I would like to continue moving forward. I was really touched by this because he got it. He saw that in his service, and then he connected that. So he saw he went to church the next day with communion and seeing that he was acting in the person of Jesus. He was doing as Jesus taught us. We used to have a big brick sculpture in the lobby of one of our academic buildings that was called Transformations, and this was at St. Joseph's College. And if you see here in this sketch, what we have here is we've got the grapes that are here, and then we've got the chalice that's here, and then we have grains of wheat here and a loaf of bread here. And we called this transformations because what we are looking at, it was by the grains of wheat here were transformed into bread by human effort. It took human effort to make that bread. And then the bread was transformed by God's effort into the body of Christ. In the same way, the grapes were transformed by human effort into wine, which was then transformed by God's efforts into the blood of Christ. And that was what we would hope that would happen with students through higher education, that they would be transformed into persons of service. And we look at it from our own perspective then, we can see the transformation that we hope takes place in our lives when through God's efforts we become more like Christ. In theological circles and liturgical circles, part of the Eucharistic prayer is called the anamnesis. Anamnesis is a fancy word that is a kind of a special type of remembering. In this anamnesis, we hope to recapture the experience. We are present at the Lord's Supper. When we're present at Mass, it's not just something that happened, 2,000 years ago, but Jesus is really present with us at the Mass. We are present at the Last Supper, and we are recapturing that experience of Jesus in the Last Supper. It also represents, that's why I hyphenated that word, it makes present again. So each time that we come to Eucharist, Jesus is made present. We are, again, making present that Last Supper that Jesus gathered with his disciples. And it also remembers that Christ is still a member of our community. It's not just a passive thing, but Jesus, when we gather there as a community of faith, Jesus is present with us in that community. He is a member again of our community. Just to conclude this little talk, what I want to look at just briefly is some other Christian denominations about their beliefs about Eucharist. In the Lutherans, they see Eucharist or communion as a sacramental union. The elements are used according to Christ's institution, when Christ instituted Last Supper. So they've got the consecration, distribution, and reception. It is a sacramental union for Lutherans. For Methodists, Christ is present in the elements, but it's in mystery. They don't have any of the Catholic understanding about like transubstantiation where Christ is really present. Christ is present, but it's in mystery. Eucharist, communion for Methodists is a holy meal of the church where the past, present, and the future living Christ come together in that communion. In The Presbyterians, they see the Lord's Supper as eating bread and drinking wine in remembrance of Christ's broken body and his blood shed for us. So it's kind of a thing of the past. Not really present as in the Catholic understanding. In the Reformed tradition, it is a symbolic meal where Christ is spiritually present. Again, a little different from our Catholic understanding where Christ is really present under the elements of bread and wine. In the Orthodox Church, they believe that it is the actual body and blood of Christ in the form of bread and wine, just like we Catholics. And the Orthodox, it seems to make sense that they would see that, as we shared almost a millennia of commonality with the Orthodox. Baptists see the Lord's Supper as, again, a symbolic act of obedience. It was by that mandate of Christ. So by partaking of the bread and the fruit of the vine, they memorialize the death of the Redeemer and anticipate his second coming in a symbolic act of obedience. So to conclude, then to be at the Lord's table, to participate in Eucharist is a call to commitment. To participate in Eucharist then is to commit oneself to being Christ to others in the world. And again, that has to be taken out of the church doors, because if there's no sacrifice, there's no communion. And I thank you for joining me for this and what I hope to be regular occasional talks. And God bless you all.